How did ancient humans actually tame horses? Picture the Eurasian steppe, roughly 6,000 years ago. It stretches in every direction further than anyone in this group has ever walked. An ocean of grass that shifts with the wind, punctuated by rivers and the occasional shallow lake. The sky is enormous. The horizon is very far away. And at the edge of what's visible, maybe a kilometer out, a herd of horses is grazing. The people watching them are not thinking about riding those horses. The concept does not exist. They are not thinking about harnessing them, or breeding them, or building a relationship with them across generations. They are thinking about protein. They are thinking about how many people the herd represents in terms of calories. They are thinking about how to get close enough to bring one down without the whole herd scattering before they can make their move. For approximately 50,000 years before this moment, that had been the entire human relationship with horses. They were prey. Large, fast, extremely alert prey that required significant skill and coordination to hunt successfully, but prey nonetheless. The cave paintings at Lascaux in France, some of the most famous prehistoric art in the world, painted roughly 17,000 years ago, include some of the most detailed and beautiful depictions of horses that have ever been created. These paintings were almost certainly made by people who hunted and ate horses. They observed them with the intensity that a hunter brings to understanding the animal they depend on for food. That is not the same as wanting to sit on one. The transition from horses are food to horses are transportation is one of the most consequential shifts in human history. It enabled the spread of cultures across distances that had previously been impassable. It transformed warfare. It accelerated trade. There is an argument made by archaeologist David Anthony in his book The Horse, the Wheel, and Language that horse domestication was directly connected to the spread of Indo-European languages across Eurasia, that the cultures of the steppe, empowered by horses, were able to expand so rapidly and so completely that their languages gradually replaced or absorbed the languages of the peoples they encountered. That argument is contested. The scale of the transformation is not. But before all of that, before the cavalry charges and the trade routes and the language spread, someone had to look at a horse and think something that nobody had thought before. Here is what made that thought difficult. A horse is a prey animal. This is not a casual observation or a metaphor. A horse's entire neurological architecture is oriented around the fact that things eat horses. Lions eat horses. Wolves eat horses. For millions of years before human hunters arrived, something was always trying to eat horses. And the horses that survived long enough to reproduce were the ones whose nervous systems were most effectively calibrated to detect and flee from threats. The result is an animal that is exquisitely sensitive to anything that might be a predator. Movement and peripheral vision, sounds that don't belong to the familiar soundscape, smells that register as unfamiliar or alarming. A horse that detects any of these things does not pause to assess the actual threat level. It runs, immediately and at full speed, with its herd following. This is the correct response when predators are the primary cause of death and assessment time costs lives. It is also the response triggered by a human being attempting to get close. Every horse that a human hunter ever approached in the Paleolithic fled before the hunter got near. This is not a coincidence. The horses whose ancestors had been successfully approached by human hunters were eaten. The horses whose ancestors were fast enough and alert enough to flee before a human could get close survived and reproduced. Natural selection had been running a very effective experiment for a very long time. And the result was an animal that treated human proximity as an emergency. This is what the first people who began keeping horses were working against. Not stubbornness, not stupidity. 50,000 generations of highly effective fear responses. So how did it actually happen? The first thing to understand is that domestication is not a single moment. It is not a human waking up one morning and deciding to tame a horse. It is a process that probably unfolded over generations, possibly many generations, as a series of small and incremental changes in the relationship between a human group and the horses in their territory. The most likely starting point, based on the evidence available, was not riding, it was herding. The evidence suggests the transition probably began with loose management of horse herds rather than capture and taming of individual animals. The Botai people, living on the steppes of what is now Kazakhstan approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, appear to have been managing horse populations in ways that suggest something more than pure hunting, but something less than what we would recognize as domestication today. This would have looked more like herding cattle than keeping pets. Human groups staying near horse herds, learning their movement patterns, gradually influencing where they went and when. Not owning individual animals, but maintaining a relationship with a herd. Moving with the herd across seasonal territory. keeping wolves and other predators away from the horses in exchange for reliable access to the animals when food was needed. The advantage for the humans was obvious. A managed herd is a reliable food supply. You know where the animals are. You don't have to track them across unknown territory. You can take animals selectively, the old, the injured, the surplus males, and leave the breeding population intact to reproduce. It's a more efficient arrangement than pure hunting. What about the advantage for the horses? In the beginning, there probably wasn't one. The horses near a human group faced predation pressure from the humans themselves. But over time, the dynamic may have shifted. Human groups who kept other predators away from the herd were providing a real service to the horses, even if the horses didn't experience it as a deliberate act. A herd living near a human group might face less wolf predation, might have access to supplementary food in difficult seasons, might benefit from the human's ability to predict and navigate to water sources. In this arrangement, the horses that stayed near the humans had a slightly different experience than the horses that fled. Not better in every dimension, but different. And the differences would, over generations, begin to matter. Over time, generations of horses born into this environment, never having experienced the direct hunting pressure that wild horses experienced, raised in the presence of humans as a constant background feature of life, rather than as an occasional threat, would have been somewhat less reactive to human proximity than truly wild horses. Not tame, not domesticated, but measurably less likely to flee immediately at the sight of a person. And within that population of horses less prone to flight, individual variation matters. Some horses are naturally calmer than others. Some are more curious. Some are less easily alarmed by unfamiliar stimuli. In a wild population, these characteristics don't matter much. The horse that pauses to investigate a human smell instead of immediately fleeing is the horse that gets killed. In a managed population, where humans are keeping predators away and the horses are no longer under the same direct survival pressure, more tolerant horses survive just as well as anxious ones, and they reproduce. And their less reactive offspring are easier to work with than the offspring of more anxious animals. Across generations, the selection pressure shifts, not through human intention exactly. Nobody is thinking, I will selectively breed the calmer horses to produce a more manageable population. They are just finding that certain animals are easier to approach, easier to handle, and easier to use for whatever they're using them for. Those animals get more interaction. They reproduce in the context of human management. Their offspring inherit whatever made them calmer. This is how domestication works. Not through a dramatic decision, but through a gradual feedback loop across hundreds of years and many generations. In 2009, archaeologist Alan Outram at the University of Exeter published a paper in the journal Science that presented evidence from the Botai site in northern Kazakhstan that dramatically changed the timeline of horse domestication. Outram's team examined horse bones and pottery shards from Botai settlements dating to approximately 5,500 years ago. The pottery contained fat residues consistent with horse milk, which means the Botai people were milking mares. You cannot milk a truly wild horse. The animal will not permit it. To milk a mare, you need the animal calm enough to allow sustained physical contact in a sensitive area, which requires a degree of familiarity and habituation that only comes from generations of managed proximity. The presence of mare's milk in Botai pottery is evidence that the Botai were keeping horses in conditions where milking was possible, which implies a degree of domestication and handling significantly beyond simple hunting. Mare's milk is also nutritionally significant. It is rich in fat, protein, and, uniquely among large domestic animal milks, ferments into a mildly alcoholic drink called kumis that is still consumed on the Central Asian steppe today. The ability to extract nutrition from a living horse without killing it, to treat the animal as an ongoing resource rather than a one-time food source, represents a fundamental shift in how humans related to horses. A horse that produces milk is an asset over a period of years. A horse that is hunted and eaten is a resource consumed once. The team also examined the teeth of the Botai horses for signs of bit wear, the specific pattern of damage to the second premolar that results from a horse wearing a bit in its mouth over an extended period. They found wear patterns consistent with bitting, which means the Botai people may have been using some form of bridle or halter on their horses. The conclusion: the Botai people, 6,000 years ago on the Kazakh steppe, were doing something with horses that went substantially beyond hunting them for food. They were milking them. They were probably riding them in some form. They were managing them in ways that required physical control and years of sustained relationship. This was the scientific community's best evidence for the origin of horse domestication, until 2021, when a team led by Pablo Librado at the Institut de Biologie Evolutive in Paris published a study in the journal Nature that used ancient DNA from hundreds of horse specimens across thousands of years to trace the origins and spread of domestic horses with unprecedented precision. The Librado study's findings were significant. The bow-tie horses, it turned out, were not the direct ancestors of modern domestic horses. The bow-tie had domesticated horses. They had clearly entered into a significant managed relationship with horse populations. But their horses represented a lineage that was largely replaced by a different domestic horse population that emerged slightly later from a different location on the western Eurasian steppe. What the Librado study identified was a specific genetic lineage emerging from the western Eurasian steppe region in the area of modern Ukraine and southwestern Russia, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. That is the ancestor of virtually all modern domestic horses. This population expanded with extraordinary speed across Eurasia, genetically replacing or absorbing most of the horse populations it encountered within a few centuries. This kind of rapid genetic replacement suggests something more than gradual diffusion. It suggests that whatever humans were doing with these horses was so significantly more effective than what had been done before. Perhaps better breeding practices, perhaps better training methods, perhaps a specific combination of traits that made these animals particularly suitable for riding, that the culture and animals spread together, rapidly and comprehensively. Now, picture the first person who actually climbed onto a horse. We don't know who they were, we don't know where exactly on the steppe this happened, or precisely when. We can estimate the approximate period. But the specific moment is lost to time, which is fitting because it probably didn't feel like a world historical event at the time. It probably felt like a very bad idea that was happening anyway. The horse would have been one of the more tractable animals in the managed herd. A young horse, probably not yet fully grown, whose nervous system had been exposed to human handling since birth and was therefore marginally less inclined to immediately flee than a fully wild animal. The person would have had to get close first, close enough to touch the animal, then close enough to lean on it, then to put weight on its back. Every horse's instinct, when something lands on its back, is to remove that thing. This is the predator response. A lion takes prey by jumping onto its back. A horse that doesn't immediately try to remove anything that jumps on its back is a horse that gets eaten. The instinct is deeply embedded, and it is correct. The first person to get on a horse almost certainly got thrown off. Many times, probably over the course of many attempts, across multiple horses and multiple days or weeks or months of effort. The person who kept trying despite this was either extraordinarily motivated, extraordinarily stubborn, or both. And then at some point, probably with a more tolerant animal than most, the horse didn't throw them off immediately. The horse ran, because the horse was still a flight animal and a person on its back was still alarming. But they ran together rather than apart. And the person found that they could influence the direction of the running by shifting their weight or using whatever makeshift reins they had fashioned. And the horse responded. And for the first time in the history of the relationship between humans and horses, a human was moving across the steppe at horse speed. Horse speed is approximately 48 to 55 kilometers per hour at full gallop. A human runner covers somewhere between 15 and 20 kilometers per hour, and only for short distances before exhaustion forces a slowdown. The person on the horse, feeling the speed of the animal under them for the first time, was experiencing something that no human being had ever experienced. They were covering ground in minutes that would have taken hours on foot. The grass was blurring under the horse's hooves. The wind was loud. The horizon was rushing toward them rather than sitting at its usual patient distance. Every human before that moment had experienced the world at walking speed. The fastest any human being had ever traveled was the speed of a sprinting human, sustainable for a few hundred meters before the body demands rest. The horse changed that ceiling by a factor of 3. Not just for a few hundred meters, for kilometers, for as long as the horse could sustain the gallop. This was, in terms of raw physics, the largest change in human travel speed that had ever occurred up to that point in history. And it wasn't just about travel speed. It was about the radius of the world that a person could meaningfully occupy. A person on foot can cover meaningful territory within a day's walk, perhaps 20 kilometers in a comfortable direction, 40 in a hard push. A person on horseback can cover 80 to 100 kilometers in a day, depending on terrain and the horse's condition. The world, for a person on horseback, was roughly 25 times larger than it had been for a person on foot. The same distance that took 5 days to walk took half a day to ride. The neighboring group that had been too far away for regular contact was now reachable for a morning visit and return. The water source that had required an overnight journey was now 2 hours away. This moment changed the world. Not immediately, not in a way that was visible in a single lifetime, but the consequences compounded across the subsequent centuries. Cultures that had horses could communicate across greater distances. Traders could cover more ground. Pastoralists could manage larger herds across wider territories. And eventually, armies could move faster and strike harder than any army on foot. The chariot, a wheeled vehicle pulled by horses, appears in the archaeological record of the Near East and Central Asia approximately 4,000 years ago. It was not primarily a transportation device for most of its history. It was a weapons platform. Two people in a chariot, one driving and one with a bow, could move across a battlefield at speeds that infantry could not match, striking and retreating before foot soldiers could respond. The military advantage this conferred was substantial enough that chariot warfare became the dominant military technology of the Bronze Age across a wide geographic area. Cavalry, soldiers fighting from horseback rather than from chariots, appears somewhat later, approximately 3,000 years ago, as riding technique and horse breeding improved to the point where a single rider with a weapon could be an effective military unit. This development extended the speed and reach advantage of horse-mounted warfare even further. By the time of the great steppe empires, the Scythians, the Huns, the Mongols, horse-mounted warriors were able to project military force across distances and at speeds that would have seemed impossible to the people who first sat nervously on the backs of somewhat calm horses on the Kazakh steppe 3,000 years earlier. All of it, every cavalry charge, every trade route, every migration, traces back to someone on the steppe who spent enough time near horses to notice which ones were calmer and kept coming back, and eventually stopped running away from each other at the same time. Here is something worth sitting with. The horse did not want to be domesticated. The horse was not waiting for humans to figure out how to work with it. The horse was an animal with a fully functional life in a fully functional ecosystem. And the relationship with humans imposed new demands and new constraints on what had been a system that worked. But the horse also, over those generations of managed proximity, changed. Not because it chose to, because the selection pressures changed. The horses that survived in human-managed herds were different horses than the horses that survived in fully wild populations. Calmer, more willing to tolerate human contact, more oriented toward the humans who provided protection from predators and supplementary food when grass was scarce. The domestic horse is not a tamed wild horse. It is a different kind of horse, one shaped across thousands of years of life, alongside humans, carrying in its genetics the accumulated history of that relationship. When a modern horse allows a person to approach it, to touch it, to saddle and ride it, it is not overcoming its nature. It is expressing a nature that was built, generation by generation, through the long, slow process of domestication. And the humans in that relationship were also changed in a different way. A culture with horses could do things a culture without horses could not. It could cover more territory, communicate more widely, trade more effectively, and fight more powerfully. The cultures that successfully domesticated horses had access to advantages that compounded across centuries, and those advantages shaped which languages survived, which populations expanded, and which cultural patterns spread across Eurasia. You are, in some ways, shaped by this too. If you speak a language in the Indo-European family, which includes English, Spanish, French, German, Russian, Hindi, Persian, and dozens of others, you are speaking a descendant of the language spoken by the people whose culture spread so rapidly across Eurasia, carried in part by horses, that it replaced most of the languages that had existed before it. The horse on the steppe 6,000 years ago, grazing at the edge of what's visible, being assessed by a human who was thinking about protein. That horse was at the beginning of a relationship that would eventually influence what language you're hearing this in. Go back to the beginning. The herd is grazing. The people are watching from a distance. They are thinking about food. And somewhere in that herd, one animal is slightly less reactive than the others, slightly more tolerant of proximity, slightly more willing to hold its ground when a person approaches rather than immediately fleeing. That horse has no idea it is about to change the world. Neither does the person watching it.